you had a NATO 2.0, which was kind of a post-Cold War NATO, very focused on these abstractions that Secretary Rubio talked about very eloquently this morning, the liberal rules-based order, and it became very dependent on the United States. And some of that, to be honest, was the fault of the political establishment in the United States. So we're not putting the fault at all on our allies, but it's shared. But what we're looking for and what we're pushing now is a NATO 3.0. And the good news is that I think, as Secretary General Rutte has eloquently said, thanks to President Trump, NATO is actually stronger than ever and is put on the trajectory for long-term sustainable, durability and strength and efficacy. And that involves a couple of things. It involves the kind of flexible realism, sort of brass tacks, practical, results-oriented mindset, a refocusing on, in a sense, going back to what you can think of as NATO 1.0, of NATO as a military alliance. And when you think of it that way, and I think it's very compatible with the zeitgeist, if you will, of the Chancellor's speech yesterday, which is, let's get down to business. Let's understand. If you go back to the 1950s, a friend of mine just sent me a quote from Konrad Adenauer from 1955-56 about you can't rely too much on the Americans over time. It's not reasonable. Let's get down to business. So I think that the main thing that we want to do looking forward with this NATO 3.0 approach is to say, all right, let's come to a much more equitable and thus sustainable model that's focused on an effective, rational defense of NATO, with Europe taking primary responsibility for its conventional defense, backed up by meeting those spending pledges, led by President Trump with Secretary General Rutte and the European leaders, that will enable that. And if you look over time, that is a really promising sort of vista where we're going to have, a Europe that is strong, that is populous, that is wealthy, that is able to field really serious military force. And I see friends of ours from the Indo-Pacific, and we're asking the same thing. I was in South Korea, the first non-NATO ally to commit to 3.5%, the new global standard, as the national security strategy has said. I think that's where, we see not a retreat of the United States from its alliances, but a kind of moderate approach that puts it on a much more sustainable path.
So, Bridge, that was a great answer, but it was a yes/no question, and the issue I have with that, and so even if everyone buys that this is where NATO 3.0 is headed and what it needs to be, the reason why the question is, at least as you called it, theological, is because it could be real. I mean, so for example, take the town of Narva in Estonia, Russian-speaking. Russia could attack and say, you know what, we take this territory. Estonia then could invoke Article 5, which everyone knows the only country that has ever done that is the United States. I mean, you can't give a NATO 3.0 answer to that. It kind of has to be a yes or no.
No, I think the NATO 3.0 answer is the answer to that, because the president points out, I'm a government official. When I was in the think tank, I might have given you a different answer. I'm a government official, and we don't engage in speculation. What the United States is doing and backs up, and the president has shown in places like Venezuela and in Operation Midnight Hammer, is he is prepared to use military force decisively to back up his pledges, to work with our allies, like our model ally, Israel. And we train, we ready our forces, we think intimately, and we have discussions about just these practicalities that show, and this is the spirit, certainly we at the Department of War, but I would say throughout our administration, is we are more in the delivering results and readiness business than in the cheap talk business. And that distinguishes us from our predecessors. I will say that directly, because you challenged me on this point. President Trump and his administration, under his historic leadership, we are doing more, and we are going to be ready, but we're putting things on a more sustainable basis, and I think that's the best answer I can give. And that's an answer that Europeans should actually, that's a credible, honest, candid, realistic answer. You can have all the shibboleths, the recitation of the shibboleths, you can have all the promises, but if you can't practically and realistically back it up and make it worthwhile to the American people, that's an empty promise.
Sure. I mean, look, the Europeans, when they've heard this and what they've responded to me in the past is that, and I don't defend the Biden administration here, but words do matter, signals matter. And, as far as that goes, there is a sense of fear in Europe that the clause doesn't matter as much anymore. Let me shift now from...
Can I just say one thing on that? I think words do matter. I think what we're saying is, we are going to make sure that we are, we and our allies are making commitments and we're following through on it. We're about delivering results. And so, I think the last administration was a lot of overpromising and under-delivering. We're sort of in the opposite, camp, or not opposite, but like being clear, strong and clear, but quiet, and kind of not looking to sort of peacock, if you will, but really focusing on building up strength. I mean, President Trump has committed to pursuing a $1.5 trillion budget. We have a historic attempt to overhaul our sort of laggardly and in some cases moribund defense industrial base to get it fit for purpose. National mobilization of our defense industrial base. That's what our allies should actually want. That's results.
Sure, fair enough. I mean, again, Mark Rutte, when he was asked this question at Davos, said very clearly, Mr. President, we will come to your defense. But let me move on from Europe to the Indo-Pacific, because you've been arguing for a while, and now the administration does as well, that by sort of shifting burden sharing in this relationship in NATO, that allows the United States to have more of a focus on Asia. Talk to us a little bit about what that has meant in the last 14-odd months of this administration.
Well, sure. I mean, I think what we say in both the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, we're going back to kind of a common sense, pragmatic focus on Americans' interests and sort of mapping our overall strategy onto where our interests are most impinged upon and most threatened, and where our contributions make the most difference, but also critically where we think our allies' interests lie realistically, and also where they can make the most material and relevant contribution. So this is a very different model from the last administration's one theater approach, which was kind of a non-military, sort of non-realistic, much more sort of normative, rules-based international order approach. Ours is saying we're going to go meet our allies where they are. We hear people here talking about, obviously, a lot about Russia. I was in Korea. They're talking a lot about North Korea. You go other places, they're talking about other countries, et cetera. We're saying, okay, we're going to work with the warp and woof. We're going to work with the current of those interests, and that's where countries will be willing to sort of put up. And then we'll take where our contribution is going to make the greatest difference and where our interests are most engaged, relatively speaking, and that's where we're going to focus. Doesn't mean we're going to do nothing in those other areas, but if you look at our strategy, it says Homeland and Hemisphere. We need to refocus. The military is a critical part of that. Obviously, a lot of that stuff is not in the military domain, but it is a critical part of that. Secondly, the first island chain and stability there, deterring China through strength, not confrontation. I think we have a very similar approach to our allies and partners there. And then in other theaters, obviously here, looking at Europe and NATO vis-a-vis Russia, looking to our wealthy allies, and I think the Chancellor made this point eloquently yesterday, saying Germany alone is a larger economy than Russia. This is a viable, tractable problem. Similarly, I was in South Korea last month. They're saying, North Korea is our primary threat. Okay. And they're willing to take the lead for conventional defense on the peninsula as well. That's what we're seeing. And so I think a lot of what we're seeing, obviously, I can't talk about in detail, but I think a lot of what we're saying is we're going to get the force back to a kind of a focus on lethality and readiness. Secretary Hegseth has made a kind of historic approach to get back to the basics there. And then on the industrial side, I mean, ultimately we see this tragically in the war in Ukraine. These modern conflicts are going to be wars of production, so we need to have a defense industry that can produce for ourselves and for our allies, and I would say we're also very supportive of our allies growing their defense industrial base, and that'll put us on a long-term trajectory, and we're confident that this will be the recipe for stability, but also deterrence and defense.
Let me talk about China now. There's a sense that between, say, 2016, the start of the first Trump administration, and, say, 24, there was a real ascendance of China hawks in DC writ large, but in the White House and in two administrations. There's a sense now that that trend has reversed a little bit, and I'll just cite a couple of things that suggest so. One is really pulling back from some of the tariff policies from early last year after China imposed export controls on rare earths and critical minerals. There's also the United States pulling back on chip restrictions for the highest end chips. And there's a growing sense when you add all of this up together that the United States has actually changed its posture on China. Would you agree with that?
Well, I'm not sure I could characterize how the overall trajectory. I would say that I think the United States wants a stable and respectful relationship with China. Obviously, we want to avoid conflict. We also want to be able to engage in mutually beneficial commerce, but we obviously recognize from the president on down that we need to do that from a position of strength. Obviously, that's commercial and economic strength. On the military side, I think we're very clear about that. That's strong and clear but quiet, that focus on the first island chain. And we need to work with our allies, particularly our allies in the Indo-Pacific, to build up a position of collective strength. I think we've been actually quite clear. I don't know how this relates. I wouldn't presume to sort of characterize it, but it's a coherent approach that's very akin to this common sense America First approach. We're not, under the president's kind of visionary leadership.
Can you define America First, just so we have like a dictionary
sure.
definition?
I would say America First, and I think a little bit of the hack for America First is the common sense approach. I think common sense, the president talks about common sense.
But my common sense is different from your common sense.
Okay, so, it's not a scientific theorem, but it's basically saying, are things working out for regular Americans, right? And I think that obviously people are going to contest what that means, and that's actually good.
It also sounds like foreign policy for the middle class.
Well, I think people are contesting. Our conceit is that we're doing a lot better job, right? And part of that is, and of course that's the president's contribution on taking and saying, like on the international trade regime, and saying, wait a minute, this is not working for Americans, and saying the sort of orthodoxy of the economist class is not actually working. Okay, we're going to relook at that. NATO, like you come to a place like the Munich Security Conference, and I say this with respect, but for many, many years, it was the same kind of the recitations, right? And the president saying, wait a minute, how does it make sense for very wealthy, prosperous, developed countries to be spending close to 1% and we're spending 4 to 5% of GDP and we're using our forces? Again, a lot of the blame goes on Americans for those decisions, but that's sort of a common sense reassessment. I think with China, I think we understand and we respect China's tremendous achievements over many years in the development of its economy, its significant, very significant military buildup, and we're acting accordingly, but we treat it respectfully and looking at it in a clear-eyed way with the goal of a favorable balance of power and stability. And those are some of the themes that I tried to lay out in my speech at the Sejong Institute in Seoul, which is to say, and I think actually in our engagements with the Chinese, they honestly, I think it resonates in the sense that obviously both sides are looking for advantage and negotiating, and that's a very direct matter. But it's not a kind of, as we've said, we're not trying to strangle China, which obviously you hear, you probably have heard this over the years, that the Chinese belief that we were trying to strangle their growth or hold them down. That's not what we're trying to do, but we're going to make sure that we and our allies and partners are operating from a position of strength. That, to me, is common sense. Obviously, we're not communists in the Trump administration, to say the least, but it's also not our job to say what the government of China is. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I will say, though, that this morning, Wang Yi, the foreign minister, when he was speaking, he did say that, for example, the UN works just fine, which was a direct refutation of what Secretary of State Marco Rubio said. And then he did point a finger at, quote unquote, certain countries. So, in as much as there's a change in policy, I'm not sure I'm seeing a great change in tone.
Well, but tone is, we're not naive. Like this is a tough, clear-eyed, relationship. Obviously, fortunately, our presidents have an excellent relationship, but this is a relationship of of two very significant players, and we're going to agglomerate our strength and position. Again, we're going to be engaging, we're going to be direct, we're going to be realistic, we're going to be respectful, but we're also going to look after the American people and also our allies and partners.
You were very influential in the writing of the national security strategy and the national defense strategy. The word Taiwan doesn't show up in either of those. Is there a reason why? And lead us into a little bit of a discussion about how you're thinking about deterrence for Taiwan.
Well, I think I have nothing to say in terms of any policy change or position or emphasis even on the issue of Taiwan. I think our president is actually quite consistent with our traditional position of the our one China policy and other things, 6 assurances, et cetera. So I think the goal is obviously these public documents. We understand that people look at them very carefully. We measure our words carefully, as I said earlier. And we, obviously the president is our spokesman on matters, especially on matters, on anything, but certainly on matters of great sensitivity. We have hewed closely to our position, and we're focused obviously on our position in the Western Pacific. But we're seeking stability. We're seeking, but stability involves both a willingness to engage, but also clarity and strength. And we're all about building up a position of strength. And if you look at the budget, if you look at what we're doing with our defense industry, if you look at what we're enlisting our allies to, well, I wouldn't even say enlisting, encouraging our allies to do for their own reasons, that's the right mix under President Trump's leadership.
So I take your point quite well about common sense, and I think there's an element about common sense that really appeals to people and even to policymakers, and even to journalists. There's an element of cognitive dissonance for me sometimes when I look at utterances from the White House and documentation and then conversations like this. So one of them, of course, at the start of the year was Greenland. It genuinely befuddled many of us trying to understand, why the United States would threaten either war or coercive economic tactics to take territory from a NATO ally. The second one, and this is more related to what we were just talking about, was the idea of a Donroe doctrine, this idea that there are spheres of influence. And so in that kind of thinking, the United States focuses more on its hemisphere. And here's my question now. What happens to the other hemisphere? Because the implication then is that China and Russia should have their way.
Well, let me actually directly answer this last point, because I hear it come up and I hear government counterparts talk about it. I see zero evidence from the United States government in any sort of authoritative statement or quarter that we are conceding, hemispheric spheres of influence to anybody else. To the contrary, the authoritative statements of the U.S. government, whether the national security strategy or the national defense strategy, literally say the contrary. Now we're working with our allies to ensure that that's a sustainable mix. But I see that as a projection, and a little bit it's sort of this normative frame that people say, oh, well, maybe they're thinking that way in my estimation, so maybe they have to give it to the others. I don't think that logic is how, certainly I think, but I don't think how people in the administration think. I think we're looking for a favorable balance of power with our allies and partners in a kind of hard-nosed, credible way. At the same time, we are also engaging. I mean, we obviously have negotiations with Moscow designed to obviously try to end the tragic war in Ukraine. We're engaging with China on a variety of fronts, trade and otherwise, et cetera, in military channels. The president's team is negotiating with Iran, et cetera. So, I mean, I think this is actually a common sense miss that if we went back and had this conference in 1980, this would seem like pretty obvious. I mean, both Ronald Reagan and his predecessors did this kind of thing. And, I mentioned the Harmel report in my speech at the Defense Ministerial, which is it's been the established dual track in NATO during the Cold War, which is, of course, you want to be strong, but you also got to see if you can narrow and potentially try to avoid a conflict if it comes because of misperception and miscalculation.
Yeah, I like that you use the word normative there in terms of like the critiques. They are normative in large part because some norms are being challenged, and I think that's where that critique comes from.
I think that's true, and I think Secretary Rubio owned that, and I said the same. I think I said the other day that I was very encouraged that I only heard the rules-based international order mentioned once while I was in Brussels, and that was a real progress.
Why don't you like the term?
Well, I think it's both a misconception. Whether it exists or not, but it actually gets people, especially in this kind of context, and misleads them in terms of the frame in which they approach the alliances. So it becomes more about a sort of catechism and how much you hew to this purported catechism, rather than a practical discussion, almost like a business-like discussion about, all right, how do we make sure that this operation is sustainable over the long term, that everybody's pulling their weight? Somebody, a good friend of mine who's involved, he said, one of the things people are trying to do, you see Secretary Besson making the point about 22 trillion. And again, I don't want to harangue the point too much, but there's sort of a mark-to-market element here, which is like, hey, wait a minute, this has been way out of whack. Let's get down to basics. And I think what I'm very encouraged to see, and obviously I disagree with a number of things the Chancellor said yesterday, and I say that with respect. Obviously, we as Americans have a different view, or we in the administration. But overall, the frame was, I would say from him, was very much leaning in and saying, let's get down to business. Let's be practical. We're going to have differences. We had differences.
I will just say, though, that when Chancellor Merz said the international order doesn't work anymore, it isn't here, I think he meant that as a criticism, and the point was...
Well, he's free to say that, but he's not indexing on that and kind of languishing there. He's saying, what I heard the message to people was to say, let's get off that. We may decry it. And actually, the minister-president of Bavaria said something similar. Let's move on. Let's get practical. And honestly, and the German government, and not just from the chancellor, but from Minister Pistorius, who's had a historic role in raising German defense spending and changing the constitution. They both deserve enormous credit, and their parties, and many others with them. That's the greatest evidence. And if we want to talk about the different, and I do think there are people in this orbit who are still indexed on that, and I think they're going to be left behind, and they're not helping Americans, but more importantly, they're not helping Europeans.
Yeah, I take all of those points. I guess, again, just one last thing on that. The rules matter because, for example, if territorial integrity in Europe doesn't matter, then China could use that as a rationale for Taiwan later. But one last question for you, Bridge, before I let you go. As this sort of very historic burden sharing change takes place, and as you and others have gotten Europe to carry more of the burden when it comes to defense spending, what does that do over time, 5 years, 10 years from now, to the nuclear umbrella question?
Well, thanks. And I mean, I really got to stress that President Trump and European leaders, Secretary General, they're the ones who deserve the credit, and there was a lot of flack, so that we got to give credit where it's due. I think there are a lot of important questions that is actually where, and I hope future, if I may say without presumption, future iterations of this conference are focused more on not under destruction, but like, hey, how do we think through these tough issues as Europe rearms? What does that mean for integration of forces? What does that mean for command and control? What does that mean for stability? What does that mean for defense industrial cooperation that's more practical and bottom line oriented? Those are, I think, and I mean, I think I can say this without, and when I've talked to Ambassador Ischinger about this, I think that's what this conference was discussing in NATO 1.0. And that's the kind of brass tacks conversations that we need. Sometimes maybe out of the Klieg lights, in the sense that they're private conversations where people can talk about stuff. I think the nuclear deterrent is an important one. As I stressed, and our department and the administration has made clear, the U.S. extended nuclear deterrent continues to apply here and to our allies. So that's, that's I think clear. There are discussions I'm hearing about, different potential formulations or adaptations. I think I'm not here to give a kind of official administration position. I think our view in general is a receptivity to a greater European coloration to the NATO deterrent. Of course, we already know that the independent nuclear deterrence of the United Kingdom and France, this is NATO policy going back to the 70s, contribute to the security of the alliance. I think we want to be very sober, deliberate about, given you mentioned norms, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty obligations, the stability considerations, et cetera, et cetera. But I think those are conversations that we should be having among partners in that kind of business-like way.
I'm going to slip in one last question. As the U.S. moves more forces and another carrier group to the Middle East, how worried are you about U.S. forces writ large being stretched beyond capacity?
Well, look, I think as it's been, made clear a couple times in the last year, I think the United States, and I can say this, I think, without boasting, that the United States has the best military in the world. The president made this, I think, point, Secretary Haig said yesterday at Fort Bragg. Nobody can match the jointness and the operations demonstrated in Operation Absolute Resolve or Operation Midnight Hammer. We have a bunch of tricks up our sleeve, and we've got a lot of them. We also are in a national mobilization of our defense industrial base. We have a Secretary of War who is restoring the warfighter ethos in the Department of War. And I'll say again, and people always say our allies and partners are our secret sauce. We agree. And we're getting our allies, well, I shouldn't even say, our allies and partners for their own reasons are stepping up, spending more, refocusing on the, kind of warfighting, I say it more in the military context, to be ready, obviously, for deterrence and peace. So I think we've got a great recipe. I don't think anybody should miscalculate either the resolve of our president, but also the capability of what the joint force and our allies can do.
All right, Bridge Colby, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Real pleasure. I'm going to keep you all here because we've got another great session that will start in just a minute or two. And I'm going to step to the side because we're going to put another 3 chairs on the stage.